Hello! Thank you for your attention for this, my final project in the seminar course, Music and Trauma, Fall of 2020. This presentation covers the lives and struggles experienced by both poet Emily Dickinson and composer Aaron Copland, as well as a performance of a selection of songs from Copland's song cycle, 12 Poems of Emily Dickinson. My goal was to find a link between their personal traumas, the art each created, and the trauma theories studied throughout the semester. A small disclaimer before I begin. The thoughts and opinions being presented in this video are, in part, my own, divulged from what I've observed in my research while putting together this presentation. Though much is rooted in factual evidence, some speculations, for example the connotations I make between Emily Dickinson's poetry and her life, are largely my personal interpretation, similarly with why Aaron Copland might have been drawn to her poetry in the first place. With that disclaimer out of the way, I would like to give an introduction as to why I chose these artists and this cycle as the focus of my presentation. Both Emily Dickinson and Aaron Copland suffered trauma in their lives and found some solace in creating art that channeled their thoughts and, as far as I can deduce, aided them in processing the larger questions and difficulties in their lives. The song cycle, 12 Poems of Emily Dickinson, is a fantastic way to shed some light on both poet and composer and connect their art with the trauma and resilience theories that I've been studying this term. During Emily Dickinson's lifetime, and likely for the vast majority of Aaron Copland's, there were few resources available to help them cope with traumas they endured. In this way, one might deduce that the inspiration to create some of their respective art be seen as a form of self-therapy in order to help process their traumas. I will continue this presentation with an introduction of both poet and composer. Emily Dickinson is regarded as one of the most prominent figures in American poetry. She was born in Amherst, a small town in Massachusetts, and was the second child of Edward and Emily Dickinson. After attending primary school until the age of 10, she and her younger sister Lavinia attended what was known as the Amherst Academy. 7 years later, Dickinson briefly attended Mount Holyoke Seminary for girls before deciding it was much too congenial to return for a second year. The rules were too strict and the religious practices too invasive. Dickinson grew up in a Calvinist household, but never made a formal declaration of faith when the town had a religious revival in 1845, and by 1852 stopped going to church completely. A poem dated around this time begins, "Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home." Throughout her life, Emily Dickinson kept in touch with friends largely through letters. A few of her most important correspondents throughout her life were her brother Austin, friends Abiah Root, Jane Humphrey, and Susan Gilbert, who would later marry Emily's brother. Some of the main poetic influences in Dickinson's life included poets Ralph Waldo Emerson and Elizabeth Browning, and the author Charlotte Bronte. Dickinson even named her only dog Carlo after the character St. John Rivers' dog in Bronte's novel Jane Eyre. Emily Dickinson composed a surge of poems around the time of the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865. During this time, she also traveled twice to Cambridge for treatment on her aching and sensitive eyes. The condition was eventually diagnosed posthumously as probable uveitis, which is the inflammation of the uvea, part of the iris. These trips are considered the last the poet ever took from her homestead. She did not leave her home unless absolutely necessary, and by 1867 had begun talking to visitors from the other side of the door. Emily's father died in 1874 after suffering a stroke. Her mother also suffered a stroke the following year, which left her partially paralyzed and impaired her memory. Emily was left to care for her very ill and bedridden mother with her sister until she died in 1882. Emily herself also suffered a stroke in 1886, dying at 55 years of age. Aaron Copland is known as the Dean of American Composers by critics and peers. Though he is most well known for his compositions, He was also a composition teacher, writer, and later a conductor of his own and other American music. Copeland was the youngest child of Russian Jewish immigrants and born in Brooklyn, New York. During his childhood, he helped out at his parents' store. He was also introduced to music at a young age, as his mother played piano and sang, his oldest brother played violin, and his older sister Laureen played piano. Laureen was also Copeland's first piano teacher. Copeland went to school at Fontainebleau in France and studied with Nadia Boulanger. He decided to stay in France for an additional 3 years as Boulanger's first composition student. Upon his return to New York, Boulanger commissioned an organ concerto for her to play when she came for her tour of the States. Symphony for Organ and Orchestra premiered on January 11, 1925 at Aeolian Hall in New York City. This period of composition for Copeland had a strong jazz influence. Around 1930 to 35, Copeland was more drawn to the influence of Stravinsky and neoclassicism. By the late 1930s, he began using Latin and American folk tunes in his more successful pieces. For example, El Salón Mexico, 1936, Billy the Kid, 1938, Appalachian Spring in 1944, and the film score for the film Of Mice and Men. Later in his career, he experimented with 12-tone technique in the 1950s and 60s, but these compositions were less well received. In the 1940s, Copeland began conducting his own works, often conducting recordings of his own material. He was self-taught and had his own personal style. He was also a music critic, writer, and teacher who gave advice to many young composers and helped them develop their own voice in their compositions. William Schumann writes, "As a teacher, Aaron was extraordinary. Copeland would look at your music and try to understand what you were after. He didn't want to turn you into another Aaron Copeland. Everything he said was helpful in making a young composer realize the potential of a particular work." Copeland's health began to deteriorate around the 1980s, developing Alzheimer's disease and dying from the effects of this and respiratory failure at the age of 90. Throughout his lifetime, Copeland received more than 30 honorary degrees and many additional awards. He was an incredibly influential composer in Western music history. There is a reason Copeland was drawn to Emily's poetry. While reading about their respective lives, I began to wonder what sort of similarities there might exist between the two of them, which would have sparked an interest from Copeland in Dickinson's poems. Perhaps he saw some of his own struggles reflected in her poetry, or her verses resonated with his own personal experience. The first thing I noticed was that both Aaron Copeland and Emily Dickinson had very close relationships with their siblings. In Aaron's life, one of the most profound effects on his appreciation of music was learning the piano from his older sister Laureen. He was the youngest of 5 children, so I can speculate he learned a great deal from all of his siblings. Emily's brother Austin was one of her correspondents who received the most letters throughout their lifetimes. Her sister Lavinia also never married, and the 2 sisters both lived at their homestead until their respective deaths. In letters, Emily affectionately called them Aw and Vinny, respectively. In a letter written to Abaya Root while she was attending the seminary in November 1847, she writes, "Austin came to see me when I had been here about 2 weeks ago and brought Vinny and A. I need not tell you how delighted I was to see them all, nor how happy it made me to hear them say that they were so lonely. It is a sweet feeling to know that you are missed and that your memory is precious at home." A relationship with her siblings was important, as it seemed, though her parents took care in raising their children and provided a very prestigious education, there may have been some lack of affection. There is some evidence of Emily's less than ideal relationship with her mother in a few surviving letters. Following her death of her mother, Emily wrote, "We were never intimate. Well, she was our mother, but minds in the same ground met by tunneling, and when she became our child, the affection came." Emily Dickinson was praised for her verse while attending the Amherst Academy. Mr. Daniel Fisk, who became principal of the Academy at age 23, recalled that Dickinson's compositions were strikingly original. and always attracted much attention at the school and, I am afraid, excited a little envy. In a letter to lifelong correspondent Tobiah Root, May 7, 1845, Emily writes that her compositions in school are exceedingly edifying to myself as well as everyone else. In the autobiography Copeland collaborated on with Vivian Perlis, he recalls composing his first bars at 8 years old and eventually decided he wanted to become a composer at 15 years old. While there are only speculations about Emily Dickinson and her potential deeper feelings than friendship towards Susan Dickinson, her school friend turned sister-in-law, Aaron Copland was known to be gay, though he kept very private about this part of his life. In Emily's case, many of the letters she wrote to Susan Dickinson, née Gilbert, contain messages of love, affection, and admiration, far beyond what we might consider platonic in today's day. In one of these letters, Emily writes, "Susie, will you intend come home next Saturday and be my own again and kiss me as you used to? I hope for you so much and feel so eager for you, feel that I cannot wait, feel that now I must have you." This is just one example with what I feel contains a strong argument that Emily had much deeper feelings for Susan than simply friendship. Susan was also the recipient of more letters from Emily than anyone else. Aaron Copland was known to live openly and travel with his intimates, yet never publicly came out as gay. Among Copland's love affairs was photographer Victor Kraft, with whom he had an oscillating companionship throughout his life. According to musicologist Howard Pollack, though, the romantic aspect of their relationship is thought to have ended by 1944. As noted previously, Emily Dickinson spent much of her life living in the same house, a recluse in later years, and though seemed to be infatuated with several close confidants throughout her life, never married. Similarly, Aaron Copland never married, though he did provide financial security as per a bequest in his will to a child fathered by Victor Kraft. I previously mentioned Dickinson's religious background, ultimately ending in her having a fascination with death and afterlife, but not committing to any church or declaration of belief. Copland also grew up in a Jewish practicing family, but remained agnostic for the majority of his life. Emily Dickinson lived through the American Civil War, and Aaron Copland was alive during both World Wars as well as the Cold War. As far as trauma suffered by both artists, Emily had a supposed poor relationship with her mother, a number of failed attempts at love or partnership, perhaps questioning of sexuality at a time when it was still very much taboo, and suffered losses of important family and friends starting at a young age. The first being the loss of her friend and second cousin Sophia Holland from typhus in April 1844, then Leonard Humphrey, a love interest and the principal of Amherst Academy, when he died at age 25 of brain congestion. Emily also had ocular health decline, some speculation that she may have had what presently would be diagnosed as agoraphobia, or the fear or avoidance of places or situations that might have caused you to panic and make you feel trapped, helpless, or embarrassed. She also survived during the American Civil War, and there is a fantastic quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica about Emily's output during the war years. In the hundreds of poems Dickinson composed during the war, a movement can be discerned from the expression of immediate pain or exultation and the celebration of achievement and self-command. Building on her earlier quest for human intimacy and obsession with heaven, she explored the tragic ironies of human desire, such as fulfillment denied, the frustrated search for the absolute within the mundane, and the terrors of internal dissolution. She also articulated a profound sense of female subjectivity, expressing what it means to be subordinate, secondary, or not in control. Yet, as the war proceeded, she also wrote with growing frequency about self-reliance, imperviousness, personal triumph, and hard-won liberty. The perfect transcendence she had formerly associated with heaven was now attached to a vision of supreme artistry. Aaron Copland also suffered traumas such as coming to terms with his own sexuality, being blacklisted and questioned in the 1950s about his political orientation and patriotism. Even though it was clear from his compositions the nature of his American values, his patriotism, and support of his home country, Aaron Copland was still brought in for questioning by Joseph McCarthy and Roy Cohn about his lecturing abroad and affiliations with various organizations and events. Copland was included on a list of 151 artists suspected of having communist associations. Aaron Copland also lived through various wars during his lifetime. On to the cycle. The 12 Poems of Emily Dickinson. Aaron Copland composed the cycle to be premiered on May 18, 1950, with soprano Alice Howland and himself on piano. The highlighted compositions were those written during the American Civil War, a time when Dickinson produced the largest bulk of her poems. It is also interesting to note that Copland composed the cycle while his country was at war as well. One of the most noteworthy additions Copland added to Emily's poetry was titles to each of the songs. Most are simply the first line of the poem, with exception of the last song in the cycle, The Chariot. This is also the first song Copland composed, as he was quite taken with the poem. After completing this first song, he sought out 11 other poems to set to music and fill out the cycle. He says, "The poems themselves gave me direction, one that I hoped would be appropriate to Miss Dickinson's lyrical, expressive language." Copland also is quoted saying that each song is meant to be complete in itself, but I prefer them to be sung in a cycle. They seem to have a cumulative effect. The subject matter of the poems Copland chose to contain center around nature, morbidity or death, eternity or heaven, love and loss, and a subtle hint into Dickinson's view on religious beliefs and her own struggle in her faith. These subjects reflect many of the traumas Dickinson suffered in her own life, from the prevalence of death present in her life from a young age to her own death at 55 years old, her beliefs and experiences with love and infatuations in her life. Copland reflects this wide range of thematic material in his composing as well. Some compositional notes I would like to point out, which are prevalent throughout the cycle, are as follows. Copland uses techniques like abrupt leaps in the vocal line to mimic the unique way Dickinson styled her poems with dashes and pauses. The poems themselves also follow an atypical rhythm and meter pattern, which makes for much through composition in the music, and also very complicated rhythms and multiple meter changes in each song of the cycle. Copland does, however, often repeat melodic or rhythmic elements of the beginning of a song at the end of that same piece, tying them all into their own neat package. Between the songs, though, one can still hear how each captures its own feeling, and though each is part of the whole, they are all unique. In an article by Beverly Soule and Ann Dorr, they eloquently phrase that Copland uses a concisely unified musical language and textual balance. It is the small interrelationships intricately woven into the fabric of the cycle which create the comfortable sense of cohesiveness. Copland also uses the technique of word painting extensively throughout the cycle. In his own words, he explains, "I followed the natural inflection of the words of the poems, particularly when they were conversational. There is a certain amount of what is called word painting, an occasional bird call, flutterings, and grace notes in the introduction of the first song, Nature the Gentlest Mother, the bugle-like melody for the voice, and there came a wind like a bugle, and so forth." In the notation of the music, Copland also indicates very specific dynamic, articulation, tempo, color, and expressive markings, as well as the projected timings of each piece. The texts Copland used for lyrics were taken from earlier publications than the 1955 Thomas H. Johnson edition, which is a more accurate transcription of of Dickinson's original poems. Martha Dickinson Bianchi, the daughter of Susan and Austin Dickinson, or Emily's niece, and Millicent Todd Bingham, Mabel Loomis Todd's daughter, who was Austin Dickinson's mistress, both took charge of publishing collections of Emily Dickinson's poems. They each took some literary liberties when they originally published the poems shortly after Dickinson's death. It was thought that slightly modifying the meter, or some words, made the poetry more approachable, as Emily had a very unique style. Her poetry was distinguished by its epigrammatic compression, haunting personal voice, enigmatic brilliance, and lack of high polish. I quote, "Although Todd claimed it was only essential changes were made, the poems were extensively edited to match punctuation and capitalization to late 19th century standards, with occasional rewordings to reduce Dickinson's obliquity. Though Copeland did not have the original source material, he still was able to have a sophisticated understanding of Dickinson's poetry." Another interesting thing to note is that each song is dedicated to a different composer whom Copeland respected very much and whom he considered to be a friend. We have arrived at the performance section of this presentation. I decided to separate each song in order to deliver my personal take on what the poetry means in each one in relation to Dickinson's life. On the screen will be the original poem as it appears in her manuscripts, which are all available online. Amazing! These also include accurate punctuation and capitalization. However, they don't match exactly the version Copeland had used when he was composing the cycle. Unfortunately, the untampered versions of the poems did not get published until 1955, 5 years after this song cycle premiered. I thought it would be interesting to include the original poems in my presentation, though, to better follow along with the text, especially as I'm singing in a mask in the audio recording and some consonants are a bit muffled. Please also note the catalog numbers at the bottom of each poem. The F number indicates the order which Ralph W. Franklin ordered the poems in his 1985 edition. The year is an approximate year Thomas H. Johnson estimated they were written in his 1955 publication of the poems, and the J number indicates Johnson's order he believed they were written in. Without further ado, I present the first selection of Copeland's song cycle, Why Do They Shut Me Out of Heaven? This poem not only reflects Dickinson's struggle with her faith, but also how she didn't fit into what society would deem normal at the time, preferring to be alone, not comfortable even leaving her bedroom or having a conversation face-to-face with family members in the last decade of her life. Did I sing too loud? To me, challenges that her ideas and poems are too much for the average person, too against the status quo. Sing a little minor, timid as a bird, means she understands what normalcy is and could choose to fit in if she wanted to. She goes on to illustrate a pearly gates situation wherein she is nearly shut out completely of heaven, asking if the situation were reversed, if she would be accepting of those who may not fit in. Why do they shut me out of heaven? Did I sing too loud? But I can sing a little minor, timid as a bird. Wouldn't the angels try me just once more? Just see if I trouble them. But don't shut the door. Don't shut the door. I see this poem as a childhood memory for Dickinson, attending church where a large organ was being played. The organ music is also a symbol for religious texts and lessons being taught at church, and Dickinson having trouble making sense of it all, though she is clearly still in awe of it. Example in the text, yet held my breath the while. After the service is over, she leaves, at the time a more Bernardine girl, which is, I believe, a reference to the Order of Cistercians. This is a Catholic religious order of monks and nuns that branched off from the Benedictines and follow the rule of Saint Benedict. They are also known as Bernardines. Dickinson is referencing a time she followed and adhered to a stricter religious lifestyle, relating it to a religious orderly's lifestyle, even if she didn't completely understand it. There is a fantastic blog by a woman named Susan Kornfeld, where she gives her take on every Dickinson poem in Franklin's order, which I found while doing research for this project. This poem especially was interesting to read the information she had found out about this poem, which was allegedly first addressed to Dickinson's father. Kornfeld writes in her blog, "It is tempting to read this poem as a contrast between normal sleeping and waking, and that final waking when all the trumpets and angels, when the faithful will be called to heaven. That is the real morn, despite what the worldly people think. However, this poem was described by Dickinson in a letter to her friends, the Hollands, as a note to her father, who apparently used to knock on her door before daylight to wake her up. She prefaced the poem by writing, 'To my father, to whose untiring efforts in my behalf I am indebted for my morning hours, viz. 3 a.m. to 12 p.m. These grateful lines are inspired by his affectionate daughter.' Read in this way, the poem reveals the animated and playful Dickinson described by those closest to her. It also hints at a close relationship with her father, at least one that could bear teasing. Reading this blog post definitely changed my own perspective and performance of the poem to be much more playful and less severe in emotion. Is the station grand, down which on either hand the hosts of witness stand? Is supposed to be by people of degree, the breaking of the day was not This poem, to me, is clearly about heartbreak. Emily had a few sparks of love or companionship in her life, but never married. If the date Johnson gives this poem is accurate, it is hard to say who Miss Dickinson is referencing in this poem. I have tried to deduce whom it may be to no avail, taking into account her biography and the important people I have found to be potential subjects mostly fall much after the date which Johnson suspects this poem was written. If accurate, this poem was written around the same time as the myriad of letters Dickinson wrote to the mysterious master or signor, letters addressed to a mystery person who is characterized as Dickinson's lover for all eternity. I found this the most illustrative poem and really sets a scene and clear picture for the performer and listener. I picture the narrator riding in a black carriage with a personified gentlemanly death figure, as well as a figure for immortality, chaperoning the journey as they are pulled along dirt roads around town by horses, perhaps a sort of light flashing before your eyes narrative. The journey ends eventually at a grave where the carriage pauses before continuing on to eternity. My thoughts are that this is where the narrator is meant to get out of the carriage for their final rest. There is an entire stanza that Copeland either did not have in his copy of the poem or chose to omit, the former being more likely, as he did not omit any other significant portion of any other of the poems. Musically, this final song is linked to Sleep is Supposed to Be, as they both contain similar opening themes and rhythms. Because I would not stop for death, kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he no haste, and I had we passed the small children played, their lesson scarcely done. We passed the fields of gazing rain. We Since then, 'tis centuries, but each feels shorter than e'er I first surmised. The horses' heads were turned Louise Harms, in the first chapter of her book, Understanding Trauma and Resilience, notes that trauma is thought of as an impact or a response because they have disrupted, overwhelmed, and destroyed a person's or community's sense of well-being and safety and capacity to cope as before. Through conducting my extensive research both into Emily Dickinson and Aaron Copland, and attempting to draw lines between the poetry found in the 12 songs of Emily Dickinson and each of their lives, I came to my own conclusions about each artist's resilience and responses to trauma, based on some of the research articles I had read this past semester in the music and trauma course. In relation to Harms's definition of trauma, I could see while reading through Dickinson's life events that something did shift throughout her life to make her feel like the only place she felt safe was in the comfort of her own home and indeed bedroom. This response to the traumas of her life, the most significant I believe to be the massive losses in her life of both friends and family members, manifests in both her subject matter of her poetry as well as her reclusive nature during the last third of her life. Though I do not think Copland's response to trauma in his life was as severe, it is a human assumption that different people have different ways of coping with trauma. Harms notes that there are sometimes positive outcomes to trauma, instances of adapting and surviving past these experiences to show resilience in the face of adversity. For Copland, I believe this resilience is shown particularly in his strong output of highly American or patriotic music output of the 1950s and 60s, especially since this is the period in which he was brought in for questioning for suspicions he had communist associations. These suspicions were dropped by 1955. One particular passage I thought was relevant to both Dickinson and Copland comes from Ursula Wirtz's book Trauma and Beyond. This statement comes from the chapter called Trauma as a Crisis of Meaning. When the universe of meaning is broken apart by trauma, the trustworthiness of the self and the world is damaged or destroyed. This experience forces us to acknowledge the illusory character of our assumptions about self, the world, and our God image. It empowers us to know reality for what it is, and thus to free ourselves from anthropomorphic images of the divine. Every search for meaning, every moment of despair over meaninglessness affects our spiritual understanding of the world and ourselves. I think this explains very well how the trauma suffered both by Dickinson and Copland had an effect on their artistic output. Dickinson's fascination with death and the afterlife, questioning her beliefs despite her religious upbringing. Copland also not practicing his familial religion as an adult and his agnostic views. It was quite fascinating to discover both of these artists and be able to really dive deep into the cycle 12 poems of Emily Dickinson in order to understand exactly what both poet and composer were going through while creating their art. A very big thank you to Emily Ansari for allowing me to get creative with this final project, and to Paul Degout for generously providing his talents in collaboration with me on my performance of these pieces. It has been incredibly interesting to do extensive research on both Emily Dickinson and Aaron Copland, and I feel like I got a small view of what their lives were like, and what events in their lives took place to drive them to create as a way to overcome their obstacles. It was quite enjoyable also to learn and perform these pieces as a component of this presentation. I hope you have enjoyed. Thank you for your attention and interest.